It's day 3 of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the United States. After the mega Indian diaspora event in Long Island last night and the tech CEOs roundtable, Prime Minister Modi will today address the Summit of the Future at the UNGA, which is the United Nations General Assembly in New York, in a short while from now. Prime Minister Modi's speech will focus on the pressing challenges of changing world order under the theme Multilateral Solutions for a Better Tomorrow. First proposed by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in 2021, the Summit of the Future is a high-level event bringing world leaders together to forge an international consensus on providing a better present and safeguarding the future. Antonio Guterres himself called it once-in-a-generation opportunity to reshape human history fostered by international cooperation. Well, after deliberations on various issues that concern the international community, countries participating in the Summit of the Future are expected to sign a pact for the future, which will have solutions relating to sustainable development, digital cooperation, as well as global governance. We'll be joined by Vishnu Shoms shortly from Manhattan. But first up, let me bring in my guests who are joining us live. Ray Locker is an author, journalist, joining me from Washington, D.C. We also have a former diplomat, Veena Sikri. Ambassador Sikri, coming to you. You know, the Prime Minister's 3 days, or the third day now, has been very, very eventful and power-packed. But do you think it's important for, the Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy to really explain his vision of the future of the world? Because, India is, of course, the most populated country at the same time. We are also a very young population, an aspirational population.
Yes, I think the Summit of the Future is a very interesting and important event. But I think we must also remember that Antonio Guterres has convened it to, what he said, bring multilateralism back from the brink. So, the UN has really not been able to play the role that was expected of it 80 years ago. It has now entered the 80th year of its existence. And I think it just has not been able to play the role that it was expected to, either in peacekeeping or in peace building, or on the economic side, or on the rights of children, or on rights of women, any aspect, even the sustainable development goals, which was a major multilateral collective decision by the members for sustainable development for all countries of the world. Because of COVID and many other reasons, these are far, far, far from being fulfilled. So indeed, he has, the UN Secretary General has convened all the countries at the summit level, the Summit of the Future, and our Prime Minister will be addressing this summit very shortly. I think it also puts very much into context Prime Minister Modi's visit to the USA, which has been remarkably successful, because in a space of 3 days, he's covered first the bilaterals. I mean, his first beginning with the call on President Joe Biden and the joint fact sheet that was issued by both Indian and US governments was remarkable in the breadth of its vision and in the depth of the intensive engagement between India and USA. And this was followed immediately afterwards by a quadrilateral meeting of the Quad. And there you had India, USA, Japan and Australia at the summit level exchanging their own views on the Indo-Pacific and bringing in so many new areas of cooperation from the Indian Ocean right till the Pacific Islands Forum, on the east to west. You can imagine the breadth of the coverage. But from there, he's now come to this multilateral. So this is really shows that for him to come to this multilateral and give his vision after having had those first 2 days engagement, that brings a great strength to it. And I do think that India is very much interested in making the UN a very dynamic body, and we are interested in reform of multilateral institutions.
Absolutely.
This has been a very important factor for us, and UN Security Council reform is going to be high on the agenda. We do know that the American government has put forward a proposal on expanding the Security Council with more permanent members, including India, but there is no veto on that in that proposal.
Yes.
So how that will fare is to be seen. But the digital compact of the future is a very good idea, as is indeed the document for the children, the generation of the future.
Yes. I can see Jonah Blank, National University of Singapore Corporation. He is a PhD there, and we also have Seema Sirohi, who is the author and columnist. But first up, let me bring Vishnu Shom now, my colleague joining us, tracking every bit of Prime Minister Modi's US visit. Vishnu, good morning to you, because you are a bright and happy early morning there in Manhattan. You know, the larger agenda, I should say, is about building that consensus, and for everyone to look forward to that consensus. The role of the head of the biggest democracy in the world becomes crucial, and that's why Prime Minister's address becomes important.
So, Maria, I think let's explain why we are talking about a summit for the future. This is what the UN Secretary General said, and let me quote: "We cannot create a future fit for our grandchildren with a system built by our grandparents." And that really summarizes what the problem is presently with the United Nations setup, which is why what they're looking at is a pact. It's a pact for a future that includes so many things. It includes a relook at the United Nations Security Council. It's a look at a global digital compact, a declaration on future generations, a focus on human rights, a focus on the global south, a focus on climate change as well. These are relevant themes. Climate change was not a theme when the United Nations was formed. The financing of green energy technology was not a theme even a few years back. Reform of the UN Security Council was perhaps not as much a theme as it was as it is today. 10 years back, it didn't quite have the same resonance when New Delhi said that, look, you know, digital, which is very a bedrock of what our government has been talking about. We've had fantastic experiences with digitalization, not just from a technology standpoint, but the experience of having used online platforms. This is something that during the G20 process, we are willing to share that technology and that experience, which is as important, of how digitalized technology can, which is part of your economic backbone, your digital backbone, whichever country it is, can effectively be used. The Prime Minister, as I understand it, will be speaking most likely on all of these themes.
Vishnu, come in on this panel discussion, and if you have a question for Jonah Blank, Ray Locker, Seema Sirohi and Veena Sikri, who are joining us, please go ahead. But first off, Ray Locker, what's your big takeaway as far as Prime Minister's first 2 days are concerned? Mr. Modi's first 2 days.
Well, it's been another successful visit for Prime Minister Modi, and it just cements his image here in the United States as somebody who's extremely important in world affairs. He continues to rally the diaspora here, which is more and more important. I've seen the importance of the Indian diaspora grow over the last few decades, where, people see Indian Americans as figures of authority. That's something that, was not always the case. And Modi taps into that every time he's here, and he's always successful with it. And so more and more people in the United States see India as a major world player and someone who, in a country that deserves greater representation in the UN, as they've been talking about over the last few days.
Across to Seema Sirohi. Seema, firstly, it's great to be stateside, close to you. Unfortunately, we haven't had the time to meet this time around. It just strikes me, Seema, that the entire Pannoon issue, which has been a headline, in fact, even in the days leading up to the arrival of the Prime Minister, when officials linked to the White House met Khalistan, those close to the Khalistani movement, that didn't end up being any showstopper at all with regard to the India-US dynamic. There's no mention of that in or joint declaration documents or documents released by the White House. In fact, the head of the USIBC, Atul Keshab, told me it's not a showstopper and that there is a certain momentum in the bilateral relationship that's going to propel it forward. Would you agree that this is an issue which may be being pursued legally, but it doesn't impact the overall relationship?
Yes, Vishnu, nice to see you. And yes, it doesn't impact the overall relationship because I think the great thing this administration has done is to separate and compartmentalize issues that can cause trouble and deal with them separately while not letting them overshadow the big bilateral relationship. And the second point I would make is the people who met the White House officials, they're not Khalistanis per se, and we should be very, very careful about using the term Khalistanis because these are people who became activists when there was the 9/11 attack and Sikhs were specially targeted, if you remember, and they became active on behalf of the community to sort of seek protections. I agree that this recent meeting is probably related to the alleged assassination attempt, allegedly by actors within the Indian government, and they were seeking some protection from what they call transnational repression. The other point is that the Sikh community is quite powerful in parts of California, as you know. They have put pressure on Democratic congressmen and women. I think this meeting was a result of that because, as you know, elections are coming up. Democrats are fighting in certain seats that are very sort of delicately balanced. And this was probably pressure from those members of Congress to the White House to placate the Sikh community. That's my read on the whole situation.
Okay. Maria?
Yes. Vishnu, of course, the big takeaway, as you said, there was a lot of anticipation. Will that find a mention? But because we are building this up to the big, summit of the future, Jonah Blank, coming to you, of course, as Vishnu was pointing out, one of the big takeaways, and as was the statement which had come from the United Nations, Secretary General, he also said that humanity has shown time and time again that it is capable of great achievements when we work together. So, do you think Prime Minister Modi's speech will be highlighting some of those areas of common cooperation?
Yes, I think very much so. I think that Prime Minister Modi's outreach to the diaspora, the United States and throughout the world has been a continuation of policy of his predecessors, but he's taken it to a new level. And on Seema's point, quite rightly, Seema notes the importance of the Sikh community within the diaspora. The very first member of the Indian diaspora to serve in Congress was Sikh. The very first, on a tragic note, the very first victim of post-9/11 anti-Muslim attacks was not a Muslim, but a Sikh, Babur Singh Sodhi in Arizona. So this is still very much a part of the discussion here in America. And I think the Prime Minister's visit appeals across all religions. When you go to his events, you do see not merely Hindus, but Sikhs, Muslims, of course, Hindus, Christians, but the whole diaspora community is very interested in showing what it's done, which has been amazing here in America.
Ambassador Sikri, let me come to you next. If you look at the bilateral between India and the United States, there are 2 or 3 areas which struck me as being really important. Number one, we have a problem about getting enough jet engines from America for our Tejas fighters, which means induction of these jets into the IAF at a time when we really need them has been really slowed down. The US is prioritizing the supply of these engines. That's clearly something we brought up, number one. Number two, the fact that the US military is going to have a hand in technology sharing as far as semiconductors are concerned in this new fab, which is going to come up in India, brings about a new equation. It's not company to company or a technology transfer which comes from different people or different. The semiconductors which will be built might have military applications in the US as well. And number three, jointly sharing responsibility for protecting our waterways in the Arabian Sea. There will be joint naval fleets between America and India. So that entire security dialogue, and I include semiconductors within that, it just seems to have taken that strategic relationship to the next level. Ambassador, can you unmute, please?
Sorry. I thank you for your question, and I hope you enjoy your time in New York. And I said hello to Seema as well. I must say that you have pointed out the key issues which highlight the extent to which the India-US bilateral relationship, the strategic components of it are becoming more and more comprehensive, more and more in-depth, and getting into levels that couldn't have been imagined even a few years ago. So I think it's important to focus on these. We do look very much to the delivery of the committed engines, and as you know, there's a mention, so we are glad to see it might happen. But otherwise, there's even looking up in India, they're talking, why is it being delayed? Is this a pressure point? Why is this happening? There's a lot of concern in India about that, because as you know, the modernization of the defense forces has really taken such a high priority and caught the imagination of the people so much as being a highly prioritized need, considering the problems we have with China on one hand, Pakistan on the other. So I think this technology transfer is very important. What you've said about semiconductors shows, highlights what this military, the role of the military is very significant. But we are all hoping that the Indus X, the India-US defense relationship, is really one of the most successful components of our relationship and is moving so well ahead in such a planned manner. The kind of service-to-service interaction that we have between India and the US is the most vast and in-depth than we have with any other country in the world. Tri-services, army to army, air force to air force, navy to navy. And as you said, what we've planned now for the Navy, the two navies together in the Middle East is significant indeed. And we're very happy that this bringing the focus of the Indo-Pacific onto the Indian Ocean as well. And this is very important because otherwise, the sea lanes of communication, and given China's activity, enhanced activity in the Indian Ocean with its so-called research ships, is a matter of great concern to India. So I think that the joint fact sheet is indeed so carefully drafted and so much based on the achievement of the two sides that even the issues that you pointed out, your question to Seema about the Panun issue and others, they are there. These issues are very much there, and they are also being talked about very much in India. But I think this is really overtaken by the depth of the relationship as it's been highlighted in the decisions, and we want that to continue as well.
Sure.
If you combine this bilateral with what happened in the Quad...
All right, Ambassador, just hold that thought for a moment. I wanted to go across to Ray Locker, who's been waiting very patiently. Ray, let's talk a little bit about the Quad. You know, the Quad isn't an overtly military group. It's meant to be a non-military group. You've got AUKUS for that. But given the strategic focus on China, which the Quad quite clearly has, do you believe that that military and governance and all the other issues seem to be working all together?
Yeah, I think they're all networked very well together. I mean, the Quad doesn't need to be a military organization. The economics of the four countries involved are bigger than the military aspect. And I think it's by strengthening, the economic ties between India, Australia, Japan, and the United States is probably more important than how many boats that you can have, sailing around the Indian Ocean or the South China Sea. Because that's really where the United States draws its strength in all those economic relationships. And so I think, military is part of it, but it's really the economic relationship that's the most important.
All right, Vishnu, if you can hear.
All right.
Yes.
There's a bit of a feedback in my ear, if that can just be corrected. Let me go back to Seema at this stage. Seema, and the final aspect of this, and we shouldn't forget about it at all, is the Modi Connect. I was there in Long Island yesterday. What I saw was incredible, because there is no dearth in the popularity of Prime Minister Modi over here. I spoke to at least 20 odd people, and I asked them one question: what are your expectations? What do you expect Prime Minister Modi to say? What do you want him to say? And the answer almost from everybody was, no, we don't really want him to say this or say that. We just come all the way here just to see him. So he's got that that aura among the diaspora, which only seems to be growing. I don't think it's come down in any way.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with you 100%. His connect with the people is quite amazing. And the community gets very active every time a visit is to take place to the United States, and there's like an intense competition among the Indian Americans as to which city they should have their rally in. And it's very, very obvious. You saw that I think there were more than 10,000, between 10 and 15,000 people. Yesterday it was jam-packed. And the enthusiasm, people wait for hours, they travel long distances. So yes, and he always delivers because he's a great orator. He can tell a story really compellingly, and people like that.
All right, Maria, why don't you go ahead with the next question?
Yes, Vishnu, you were pointing about and discussing the Modi Connect, something that I also saw, before the beginning of the third term in Abu Dhabi. We have seen that Prime Minister particularly connects very, very well with the Indian diaspora. There is that where he talks about the future. This time around, he spoke about the mandate, the elections, and how he sees his third term. So I think the third term through his eyes and how he has perhaps roadmapped it became very, very significant in that Long Island speech of the Prime Minister, where there was a lot of celebration also by the Indian diaspora. But talking about the Summit of the Future as we build to it, Vishnu, coming to you on that aspect, because the Summit of the Future address by Prime Minister becomes important. If you can give us some understanding of who all have addressed this summit so far, and who is likely to speak after the Prime Minister, because we were told that there would be a pact as well, which will be signed by world leaders.
Yeah, so this is all about the creation of the pact. I'm not entirely sure who's spoken so far. The Prime Minister will be speaking in about 37 minutes from now, as I understand it. The schedule can actually move a little bit here and there. But what they're looking to do is to get a pact for the future that includes a global digital compact and a declaration on future generations. And I'm just going to go back to that wonderful quote from the United Nations Secretary General on why this is all happening. And he said, we cannot create a future fit for our grandchildren with a system built by our grandparents. So that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to make the United Nations much more relevant. I want to go through a couple of other points, Maria, on what this is all about. The entire pact is in fact an effort designed to turbocharge the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. If this doesn't happen, then we are all in trouble. We need to deal with with climate and climate change as a global community. It cannot be done in silos. Towards that end, there is an important effort or focus at mobilizing finances from multilateral development banks to help developing countries meet their requirements. Again, this is something that came up in the G20 process. In fact, India and NK Singh had a very major role in working or putting out a document which looked at the restructuring of multilateral banks, as a result of which financing for clean energy transition to countries in the global south would be much easier than it was earlier on. This is no longer a question of, or should it be done, and are we convinced about the ability of countries to pay back? What are the terms going to be? All that is fine, but the fact is that there has to be a clean energy transition. Somebody has to pay for it. And in the absence of the West paying for it, there have to be mechanisms which enable a friendly and transfer and an economically viable transfer of this technology. Therefore, there is an effort also at reviewing the sovereign debt architecture to ensure that developing countries can borrow sustainably to invest in their own futures. The IMF is important in this. The G20 is important. The UN is important in this. Like a lot of countries have their sovereign debt. Does that mean that because I have a debt that I cannot look at the future of millions of people on my soil, that climate change, technology to avert climate change, which I required, I will forget about? No, not at all. So sovereign debt restructuring and the architecture of sovereign debt needs to be looked at. So those are a couple of points that I have not touched on so far. We can talk a lot about the entire digitalization aspect of the Summit for the Future, later on, Maria, but I thought I would touch upon these points, linked to financing, technology, which is so very imperative for all of us.
All right, Vishnu, continue to be with us. We are slipping into a short break. I would like to thank Seema Sirohi, Ray Locker, Jonah Blank, and Ambassador Sikri. A short break, and then we continue this coverage.